I always liked being alone in the woods. It was quiet, away from everything, and it gave me time to clear my mind. I had been hunting since I was a kid, taught by my father and uncles. Over the years, it became something I did more for the peace than the actual hunting. It was the middle of October, and I had a weekend free. The weather was cooling down, making it perfect for a solo hunting trip. I loaded my truck with my rifle, camping gear, food, and extra supplies just in case. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place I had visited a few times before but never camped overnight. It was remote, far enough from roads and towns that I wouldn't hear anything but nature. I left early in the morning, driving miles down dirt roads until I reached the trail I had marked on my map. I parked the truck, took my pack and rifle, and started hiking. The forest was thick, with tall trees that blocked out most of the sun. The trail was barely visible, more of an old logging road than anything else. I followed it for a few miles, then cut off into the trees to find a good camping spot. By midday, I had set up my camp. A small tent, a fire pit, and a little area to clean whatever I caught. I spent the afternoon scouting, walking through the woods, looking for tracks and signs of deer. I found a good spot near a clearing with fresh tracks and decided that's where I'd set up the next morning. As the sun went down, I made a small fire and cooked some food. The night was quiet, just the sounds of the forest around me. I sat by the fire for a while, listening, enjoying the stillness. Eventually, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no whine through the trees, nothing. That was never a good sign. It meant something was out there. I reached for my rifle and slowly sat up, listening. Then I heard it, a slow, steady crunching of leaves, like something walking carefully through the woods. It wasn't far, maybe 50 yards from my tent. I strained my ears, trying to make out what it was. A deer? Maybe, but it sounded heavier, more deliberate. I stayed still, waiting, my grip tightening on the rifle. Then it stopped. For the next few minutes, there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, I laid back down, keeping my rifle close. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came and I got up with the first light. I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I had that feeling, like I was being watched. I shook it off and got ready for the day. I hiked back to the clearing I had found and settled in. The woods were alive again, birds chirping, the wind moving through the trees. I waited, scanning the trees, listening for movement. Hours passed, and nothing came. Then, just as I was about to pack up, I heard something behind me. A branch snapped. I turned, expecting to see a deer, but there was nothing, just trees. The feeling was back, stronger this time. My instincts were screaming at me. Something wasn't right. I decided to head back to camp. As I walked, I checked over my shoulder more than I should have. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I got back, I saw it. Tracks. Not deer tracks, not bear tracks. Human. And they weren't mine. They circled my camp, stopping just outside my tent. I stood there, my rifle in my hands, my heart pounding. Someone had been here, watching me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. I forced myself to stay calm. I had my rifle, I had my knife. I wasn't defenseless, but I wasn't alone either. I spent the rest of the day on high alert, listening, watching. I kept my fire going, even though it wasn't cold. If someone was out there, I wanted them to know I was awake. Night came and I sat by the fire, rifle across my lap. I had a feeling I wouldn't be sleeping much. And I was right. Somewhere past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, closer than before. I gripped my rifle and waited. The footsteps stopped, maybe 20 yards from camp. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew it was there. Then the worst part, breathing, not an animal, person, just standing there hidden in the trees, watching me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, my finger resting near the trigger. Minutes passed. Then, without a sound, the presence faded. The breathing stopped. The footsteps never started again, but I knew it was still out there. I didn't sleep that night. I waited for the first light, then packed up camp as fast as I could. As I walked back to my truck, I checked behind me constantly. The feeling of being watched never left. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear in, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then, just as I started the engine, I saw it, a figure, standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Watching, I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and got out of there. I never went back to that spot again, and I never camp alone anymore. I didn't plan for the rain. I should have. The forecast mentioned it, but I didn't take it seriously. It had been a long week, and all I wanted was to be away from everything for a while. No work,
No noise.
no people, just the woods, my tent, and the sound of nature. I chose a spot deep in the forest, far from the usual campsites. It wasn't my first time camping alone, and I preferred it that way.
No crowds, no interruptions.
Just me and the quiet. The drive was long, the road narrow, winding through the trees like a forgotten path. By the time I arrived, the sky was already turning dark. Heavy clouds stretched over the treetops, thick and unmoving. I found a clearing near a small stream, perfect for setting up camp. The ground was damp but firm. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and built a small fire before the rain started. Came suddenly. No warning. Just a few drops, then a downpour. I sat under the small tarp I had strung up between two trees, watching the fire struggle against the rain before it finally gave up. The sound of water hitting the leaves was deafening, drowning out everything else. I could barely see past the trees, the darkness growing thicker with the rain. I stayed outside for as long as I could, staring into the blackness, listening. There was nothing to hear but rain and wind. No animals, no movement, just rain. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, closing the flap behind me. The sound of the rain hitting the fabric was rhythmic, constant. I tried to sleep, but something felt off. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual unease that came with being alone in the woods at night. But that didn't explain the feeling in my gut, the slow realization that something wasn't right. I stayed still, listening. Then, wind, something else. A sound, faint, almost lost in the rain. A rustling, but not from the wind. It was close, too close, just beyond my tent. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I thought I could hear it over the rain. The rustling stopped. Silence. Then the sound of water splashing, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was moving. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, my fingers cold and stiff. I didn't turn it on. Not yet. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The rain kept falling, loud, masking every other sound. But I knew something was there, watching. I forced myself to breathe, slow and quiet. My body was tense, waiting for something to happen. The tent felt small, like a cage. I wanted to move, to look outside, but I couldn't. I didn't want to see. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the feeling was gone. The rain, the wind, nothing else. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes shut against my will. When I woke up, it was still raining. The light outside was dim, barely breaking through the clouds. I lay there for a moment, remembering the night before. It almost felt like a dream. Almost. I sat up slowly, my body stiff. Everything was wet. The floor of my tent was damp, my sleeping bag heavy with moisture. I unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold morning air. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my tent, deep in the mud, half filled with rainwater. They were fresh. Someone had been there, watching. I scanned the trees, my stomach twisting. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, just the endless rain. I crouched down, touching one of the prints. It was large, larger than my own boot print. I had camped alone. I wasn't alone. I packed quickly, my hands shaking. Every movement felt slow, too slow. I wanted to be gone, to be out of the woods before whoever made those prints came back. The rain didn't stop. It poured harder as I took down my tent, soaking me to the bone. My gear was heavy, my backpack digging into my shoulders as I started walking. I didn't look back. I followed the path I had taken in, my boots sinking into the mud with each step. The footprints followed me for a while, overlapping mine in some places. Then they veered off, disappearing into the trees. I kept walking. The trail felt longer on the way back, the trees pressing in on me. The rain made it hard to see, blurring everything into a gray haze. Every sound made my heart jump. Something moved in the distance, a shape. I stopped. It was far too far to see clearly, but it was there, standing between the trees, watching. I didn't wait. I walked faster, my legs burning, my breath short. The rain covered my footsteps, but I could feel something behind me. I reached my truck, my hands fumbling with the keys. The door creaked as I pulled it open, the sound too loud. I climbed in, locking the doors, my breath coming fast and uneven. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring into the woods. Nothing. I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. The noise felt unnatural, too loud against the silence. I pulled away, the tires slipping in the mud as I drove down the narrow road. The trees blurred past, the rain washing everything away. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away, back on the main road, the forest nothing but a shadow in my mirrors. The rain never stopped, followed me all the way home. I locked my doors that night, checked the windows twice, but I still felt it, that feeling, the same one I had in the tent, the weight of unseen eyes. I didn't sleep. The rain kept falling, and somewhere, out there in the woods, someone was still watching. I was never the type of person to scare easily. I had spent years hiking, hunting, and camping in remote areas, sometimes for days at a time. Being alone in the wilderness never bothered me, until that trip. It was late October, and the weather was turning colder. I had taken a few days off from work to go deep into the woods of northern Minnesota, far from any towns or main roads. I wanted complete solitude, a break from people and noise. The plan was simple. Hike 10 miles into the national forest, set up camp by a small lake, and spend a few nights enjoying the quiet before heading back. I packed light but made sure to bring all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, enough food, a rifle for hunting, and a handgun for safety. Not that I had ever needed the gun before, but it was always better to have it and not need it. I parked my truck on the side of an old logging road, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started my hike. The first day went exactly as planned. The trail was empty, and I didn't see another person for miles. By mid-afternoon, I found the perfect spot, a clearing near the edge of the lake, sheltered by tall pine trees. The water was calm, the air crisp, and aside from the occasional bird or rustling of leaves, It was silent. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal as the sun dipped below the treeline. The isolation felt good. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside the tent, but it was probably just a raccoon or a deer. I stayed awake for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the forest, then drifted back to sleep. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I followed a small game trail that led deeper into the woods, carrying my rifle just in case I came across anything worth hunting. About a mile from camp, I stumbled upon something odd, a pile of bones. At first, I thought they were deer remains, but as I got closer, I realized they were stripped clean, scattered around, and some looked like they had been broken open. A hunter might have left them, but the way they were arranged felt unnatural. I didn't like the feeling that settled in my gut, so I turned back to camp. On the way, I noticed something else. Broken branches, not from an animal brushing against them, but snapped clean at odd heights. Some were shoulder high, others lower, like something big had come through the area. Back at camp, I tried to shake the unease. I told myself it was nothing, but that night things changed. I was lying in my tent, staring at the fabric ceiling, listening. The woods were too quiet. No insects, no night birds, just silence. And then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, close. I reached for my handgun, keeping my breath shallow. The footsteps circled the tent, pausing every few steps. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the shift of weight. Not an animal. An animal would move differently, faster, more erratic. This was steady, controlled. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping my gun, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. I waited. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was dawn. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the area. There were footprints in the dirt. Large human footprints. They circled my tent and then disappeared into the trees. I packed up my gear within minutes. I wasn't about to wait around and see who or what had been out there. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept my handgun in my grip, scanning the trees every few steps. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and sped off down the old logging road without looking back. I still don't know who was out there. A hunter? A hiker? Someone living off the grid? Or something else? I never went back to that part of the woods. Some places I've learned are better left alone. I always loved camping. It was something I had done since I was a kid. Growing up in Oregon, my dad used to take me out into the woods almost every other weekend, teaching me how to fish, how to track animals, how to navigate without a map. Stuck with me. Even after I moved to Montana for work, I made a habit of heading into the backcountry whenever I had the chance. It was peaceful. No people, no noise, just me and nature. That's why, in the fall of 2019, I packed up my truck and headed out for a solo trip in the Bitterroot National Forest. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning, and the forecast called for clear skies. It was perfect. I chose a remote spot, about 30 miles from the nearest town, up an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. I had found the place on an old hunting map, a small clearing near a creek, tucked between dense pines. No trails led there. It was exactly the kind of isolation I wanted. I got there in the late afternoon, just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, built a fire pit, and gathered some wood before it got dark. By the time I had a meal cooking over the flames, the night had fully settled in. It was the best feeling. Just me, my fire, and the distant sounds of the forest. Then I noticed something. The usual noises, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl had gone silent. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals get spooked all the time, but after a few minutes, the quiet started to feel unnatural. Even the wind seemed to stop moving through the trees. I sat by the fire, poking at the embers, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not an animal. Something walking, moving slowly just beyond the tree line. I froze. I knew the sounds of the forest well enough to tell the difference between a deer moving through the underbrush and something else. This wasn't a four-legged animal. It had the weight and pattern of something walking on 2 feet. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just my imagination. Maybe the trees shifting. I forced myself to relax, but I kept my rifle close, just in case. The night passed without any other disturbances. By morning, the uneasy feeling had faded, replaced by the comfort of daylight. I spent the day fishing in the creek, hiking a bit, and enjoying the solitude. By the time the sun dipped again, I had almost forgotten about the footsteps. Almost. That second night, the silence returned. The same unnatural stillness, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. And then the footsteps came back. This time, they were closer. I gripped my rifle, my heart pounding. The fire crackled beside me, casting long shadows across the clearing. I aimed my flashlight at the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. A shape. It was low to the ground at first, almost like a crouched animal. But then it shifted, stood up, and it was tall. Too tall. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out its face, only the outline of its body, lean, almost human, but wrong. The way it stood, the way it moved, was off. I didn't wait. I fired a shot. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees, and the shape vanished. Not ran, just disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, my rifle in my lap, scanning the tree line until dawn. When morning finally came, I packed up. Fast. I wasn't going to spend another night there. But before I left, I found something. Near the edge of the clearing, just where I had seen the thing standing, were tracks. They looked like deer tracks at first until I looked closer. The hooves were too big, and instead of running in a straight line, they twisted, almost like whatever made them had been walking upright. I didn't stay to investigate. I got in my truck, drove back down that logging road, and never went back. Even now, years later, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. There's something out there in those woods, and it's watching. I had always loved camping. There was something about being away from the city, deep in the woods, that felt freeing. No streetlights, no honking cars, no artificial sounds, just nature. That's what I told myself when I packed my gear and drove up north to a forest I had read about online. It was a remote place, barely touched by tourists, and that's exactly why I chose it. I had taken plenty of solo camping trips before, but this one was different. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I figured I'd be fine, as I had always been. I had my gear, my food, and a good sense of direction. I had no reason to worry. The drive took longer than expected. The roads became rough, full of potholes and overgrown with weeds. My truck bounced and rattled as I navigated deeper into the wilderness. There were no signs, no markers, just a dirt path that stretched endlessly. It was clear that not many people came this way. By the time I reached the spot I had in mind, the sun was beginning to set. The trees were tall and dense, the forest floor covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. There was a small clearing next to a creek, perfect for setting up my tent. I stepped out of the truck and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was peaceful. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a fire. As the flames crackled, I ate a simple meal and listened to the sounds around me. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. Then I noticed something odd. The forest was too quiet. I had spent enough nights outdoors to know that the woods were never truly silent. There were always little sounds, small animals scurrying, distant howls, twigs snapping. But now everything had stopped. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator was nearby, and the smaller animals had gone quiet. That was normal. I convinced myself of that and forced myself to relax. I put more wood on the fire and sat there for a while, staring into the flames. My eyes started to feel heavy. I decided to get some rest. I don't know what woke me up. One moment I was asleep, and the next, I was wide awake, heart pounding. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The darkness outside was complete. I lay there listening. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound. Something was moving just outside my tent. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. It wasn't a raccoon or some small animal. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Someone was walking around my campsite. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I waited, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing every few seconds. Then they stopped. I flicked on the flashlight. Nothing. I unzipped the tent and shined the light around. The forest was empty. The trees stood motionless, their branches barely swaying. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed the sounds. Maybe the wind had rustled the leaves in a way that sounded like footsteps. I got back into my tent and forced myself to sleep. Morning came, and with the daylight, my fear felt foolish. I told myself I had just been jumpy. I had spent too much time reading horror stories online, and now I was letting my mind play tricks on me. I ate breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to go on a hike. The forest was dense, but beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patches on the forest floor. The air smelled fresh, earthy. I followed a narrow trail, marking my path with small scratches on tree bark so I wouldn't get lost. After about an hour, I found something strange. A campsite, but it wasn't like mine. It was old. The tent was collapsed, its fabric torn and covered in moss. The fire pit was nothing more than a circle of blackened stones. Rusted cans and faded wrappers littered the ground. Whoever had camped here had left in a hurry. I felt uneasy. I looked around, searching for anything that might explain why the place had been abandoned. Then I noticed the trees. Deep, jagged cuts ran along their trunks. Not scratches from animals, these were man-made. Someone had hacked into the wood with a knife or an axe. Some of the cuts formed strange patterns, almost like symbols. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to head back. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. The memory of the abandoned campsite lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. I was more alert, listening for any sounds beyond the fire's crackling. Hours passed. Then, just like the night before, the forest went silent. I held my breath. A twig snapped. The footsteps returned, slow and careful. They moved around my tent the same way they had before. I clenched my knife, every muscle in my body tense. Then the footsteps stopped. I listened, waiting. Suddenly, the fire flickered. The light dimmed for just a moment, as if something had passed in front of it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it outside. Again, nothing. But then I saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones. They circled my tent, leading off into the trees. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gripping my knife, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things. I didn't bother eating. I needed to leave. I threw my gear into the truck and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt path, I glanced into my rearview mirror. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see their face. They didn't move, just stood there watching as I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I reached civilization, until I saw houses, streetlights, people. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. It was late September when I was called out for the search. The kind of cold that crept into your bones had started to settle in, and the trees were already thinning out, their leaves turning brown and dry. I was stationed in a small town that didn't see much action beyond the occasional drunken brawl or domestic dispute. But that week had been different. A man had gone missing near the outskirts of the forest, about 20 miles from town, near an old campground that hadn't been in use for years. His truck had been found just off the dirt road, keys still in the ignition, door wide open like he had stepped out for a smoke and never returned. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away, just an empty vehicle, some beer cans in the back, and an eerie silence that felt too heavy for comfort. I was sent out with 2 other officers to look for him. The department wasn't big, just a handful of us handling an area that stretched far beyond what we could realistically cover. The plan was simple: set up camp near where his truck had been found, comb through the nearby forest, and radio in if we found anything. I had been on search and rescue cases before, but something about this one felt off. Maybe it was the way his truck had been abandoned, or the fact that nobody had reported him missing until his boss called to ask why he hadn't shown up for work. No family had reached out. No friends seemed particularly concerned. It was like he had vanished, and nobody cared enough to notice. By the time we reached the site, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. The dirt road leading up to the campsite was narrow, barely wide enough for our trucks, and the surrounding forest was dense, so thick that even with flashlights, the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. We set up camp near a small clearing, close enough to the abandoned truck that we wouldn't have to go far when we started the search in the morning. The forest was silent, apart from the occasional rustling in the trees and the distant call of an owl. No wind, no other campers, just us and the endless stretch of trees. The first night was uneventful. I lay in my tent, staring up at the nylon fabric above me, listening to the sounds of the forest. The others had already fallen asleep, their quiet breathing mixing with the faint crackle of the dying campfire. I wasn't sure why I couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, like I was being watched. By morning, we packed up what little we needed and started the search. We split up, keeping within radio distance, each of us covering a different section of the forest. The ground was damp, the air thick with the smell of decaying leaves and wet earth. I moved slowly, scanning every inch of the ground for anything out of place. Footprints, torn fabric, a dropped wallet, anything that would tell me where he had gone. Hours passed, but there was nothing. No signs of life, no signs of struggle. Then I found something, a shoe, half buried beneath the leaves, mud caked along the edges. It looked new, too new to have been sitting out in the elements for long. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt, and felt my stomach twist. It wasn't just a shoe. There was a foot still inside it. The radio crackled before I could say anything. Another officer had found something too. I forced myself to stay calm, pressing the button on my radio and responding before making my way toward him. The trees felt closer now, the air heavier. Every step I took felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. When I reached him, I understood why. The body wasn't intact. It had been torn apart, scattered like something had gotten to it before we did. His torso was about 10 feet from where his leg had been found. His arms stretched out in different directions, fingers curled as if he had been clawing at the ground. There was no blood, at least not as much as there should have been. The ground beneath him was dry, like whatever had killed him had taken the blood with it. I've seen animal attacks before. I know what a bear or a mountain lion can do to a human body. This wasn't that. It wasn't clean. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. We called it in, but backup was hours away. We were too far from town, too deep in the woods. So we waited, and as we did, the forest got quieter. Too quiet. I kept my gun close, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing.
No birds.
No rustling leaves, just silence. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the trees, half hidden behind the trunk of a rotting oak. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was watching. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. By the time backup arrived, the body had already started to decay, faster than it should have. The smell was unbearable, the flesh almost unrecognizable. They ruled it an animal attack, closed the case. But I know what I saw, and I know whatever killed that man, it wasn't an animal. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I don't plan to. I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed getting away from everything. The noise, the crowds, the constant distractions. None of it suited me. That's why camping had always been my escape. It was simple. A tent, a fire, and the open woods. No emails, no traffic, no stress. Just me and the wild. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had planned it for weeks. Picked a secluded spot in Montana, a few miles away from the nearest dirt road. It was deep in the woods, but not so far that it would be dangerous. I had my gear, my food, and enough supplies to last 4 days. I got there in the early afternoon, parked my truck just off the trail, and hiked in about 2 miles before setting up camp. The weather was perfect. Warm but not too hot, a slight breeze rustling through the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal over the flames as the sun started dipping below the trees. By the time night fell, I was completely alone. The only sounds were the distant calls of night animals and the occasional snap of a twig in the underbrush. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. I sat by the fire for a while, letting the warmth seep into my skin, staring at the glowing embers. Around 10, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and closed my eyes, letting the silence wrap around me. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, not because of a noise, at least I didn't think so, but because of a feeling, that uneasy, creeping sensation of being watched. I lay still, my breath slow and controlled, listening. Outside, the forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, all of it was gone. It was just silence, thick, suffocating silence. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The inside of the tent was the same as I had left it. Nothing disturbed. The fire outside had burned down to glowing coals, casting weak light against the fabric of my tent. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just woken up for no reason. It happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out, sweeping my flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. Just trees, the dim glow of the fire, and my gear leaning against a log. Then I saw it. A few feet beyond the dying fire, Just at the edge of the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a coyote, but as my light landed on it, I realized it wasn't. It was a man. He was standing half hidden behind a tree, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. A spike of adrenaline shot through me, but I stayed completely still, hoping maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but they weren't. He was real, and he wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another figure, then another, 3, maybe 4, standing just beyond the reach of my fire, watching me. My mind raced. Who were they? Hikers?
Locals.
But why weren't they saying anything? Why were they just standing there? A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My truck was 2 miles away. There was no quick way out of this. I slowly reached for the hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. My rifle was in the truck, too far away to do me any good. My only options were to wait them out or make a run for it. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring at the tree line. The figures didn't move. They just stood there. At some point, exhaustion took over. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the sun was rising, and they were gone. I unzipped the tent cautiously, stepping out into the clearing. My fire had burned out completely. The woods were quiet again, but this time it felt normal. The tension from the night before had lifted, as if whatever had been there was truly gone. I checked the perimeter of my campsite, looking for any signs that someone had actually been there. Footprints, broken branches, anything, and I found them. Footprints, at least 6 different sets, circling my tent. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just threw everything into my pack and started the hike back to my truck. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched. I didn't hear or see anything, but the feeling never left me. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, not stopping until I hit the highway. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. I haven't been camping alone since.